Republicans in the House are mounting a Hail Mary against the domestic surveillance provisions of the National Defense Authorization Act, which is set for final vote this week. Now, Senator Rand Paul has called the continued existence of the Fisa surveillance program unconstitutional and predicted it may very well be removed from this act if libertarian-leaning members of Congress get their way. Here to discuss these topics and more is Senator Rand Paul himself. Welcome back to Rising, Senator.
Glad to be with you.
So update us. I believe a vote was taken in the Senate yesterday, and unfortunately not enough people joined you and some of your colleagues who did stand against this provision. Update us on the state of the votes being taken place.
You know, I was pleasantly surprised how close we got, actually. Mike Lee and I led the effort to try to remove FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, from the defense bill. There's a Senate rule that says you can't put things into a conference report that wasn't in either the original Senate bill or the House bill. But the bottom line is our arguments were not technical arguments. Our arguments were that FISA collects data on Americans and they search Americans routinely without a Fourth Amendment warrant. And I think that this is something incredibly important. It's not a rare occurrence. The FBI searched the database for Americans' data, communications, et cetera, over 3 million times in a recent year. So this is not an uncommon abuse of power. And I think it's incredibly important that we say for Americans' communications that you should have to go to a public court, to an Article 3 judge, and obey the Fourth Amendment, that there's probable cause of a crime. Under FISA, they use a lower standard, probable cause of a relationship with a foreign entity, which ultimately really is also really dumbed down or made less stringent to meaning if you've ever talked to a foreigner on the phone. So there's just millions of phone calls, emails, text messages back and forth between foreigners and Americans. And I'm okay with the lower standard if you're going to be searching somebody in Libya. But if an American is in the database, you shouldn't be able to search it without going to a real judge in a public court.
So the votes in the House have been described as a Hail Mary. Can you give us a sense of what the landscape is likely to be and what it would take to stop this from being reauthorized?
Well, the rules are very strict on what can be done to a conference report. Now, they have control of the House, so they can either choose to vote on the conference report or they can choose on voting on alternatives that include some reforms. But a few days ago, the reforms, they said they were going to vote on two different possible reforms. The establishment bill, which really doesn't, does window dressing and doesn't reform the FISA, and then one by Jim Jordan that actually would have more significant reforms. But then both of those were pulled. So I'm not sure the ultimate outcome. If I had to predict, I think basically they'll end up passing the conference report the same way we did, which punts this debate to the spring. So if I had to guess what's going to happen is there'll be no reform this year, and we'll wait 3 or 4 months and have a possibility of again. But realize this isn't an accident or, oh, no, we don't have enough time. This expires every 5 years. And so they've had 5 years to think about it, and we've had several years since the Carter Page abuse of power to the Trump campaign to think about this, and yet at the last minute they seem to have no time. Most of them, this is a planned sort of way of trying to avoid reform. The FBI usually comes forward and says, oh, we'll do better. We promise to do X, Y, and Z, and then they don't do it. For example, a few years ago, Congress told the FBI that every time they searched it, they had to write down a reason. At the very least, write down your reasoning for why you're searching an American. And they searched 3 million Americans and didn't put the reason down, a dozen times. They just don't obey their own rules or any rules. And really what you need is oversight, and it has to be public oversight of Congress.
So many conservative voters are clearly outraged about what they view as abuses of law enforcement, what's described as the weaponization of the federal government. This is one of the top concerns of Republicans who vote in primaries, of Republicans who supported President Trump. Now Republicans hold the House. It seems like it would be so easy and so obvious to get this win for the base. Frankly, what does it say about D.C. that this is, and of course this is bipartisan. You had very, very liberal, very progressive members of the Senate, Democrats, joining you in this vote because it's really a civil liberties measure, not strictly a partisan measure, and yet Republicans voters so clearly care about this. Why is it still so hard to get it done in a chamber, not your chamber, but the other chambers controlled by Republicans?
There used to be more right-left continuum on this, with progressives coming forward. And, think about back in the 1960s, the left was actually much more condemnatory of the FBI for the illegal wiretaps of Martin Luther King, civil rights protesters, Vietnam War protesters. The left was very good. But when it came about a few years ago that the person that was the victim was Donald Trump, they just seemed to not care so much. The derangement with hatred of Donald Trump made it such that they couldn't remember it's about the principle, not the person. For example, I'll give you, this is a perfect example. Brandenburg versus Ohio is a big famous First Amendment case from back in the 50s. The guy was a despicable person. He was a member of the KKK, and the things he said we won't even repeat on air because they're reprehensible. And yet he was defended by the ACLU, a Jewish attorney, and Eleanor Norton Holmes, an African-American attorney, young attorney, who's now in Congress and has been for a long time as DC's representative. But when she was asked about Trump's comment at the January 6th rally, she basically said, oh no, the First Amendment doesn't apply here. He should be arrested for this. And it's like, my goodness, what happened to not really thinking about the person or what they're saying and thinking about the principle of speech? And I will say one good aspect, though, or one thing that's happened positively is when they voted on Jim Jordan's reform in the judiciary, the vote was 35-2. So really, every Republican and almost every Democrat voted to say that the FBI should have to have a warrant to search the database for an American. And this would be a step forward, but I think the whole database is unconstitutional, frankly. But I would vote for the reform of instituting a warrant requirement because it would at least protect Americans' data to a certain extent.
Senator Paul, I really take your point about the failure of having some bipartisanship over issues that at one point were really sincerely held as important by the left. Similarly, we're seeing a lot of folks on the right who have historically really pushed the importance of free speech on college campuses and beyond, supporting a number of actions that have been characterized as quite the opposite, authoritarian even, from the censorship of Rashida Tlaib to the resolution to equate anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism, to the hearings last week in which a number of Harvard students came before the House to talk about their feelings of safety or lack of safety on college campuses. And I wondered if you could opine on what you think is going on with some conservatives who previously espoused the view that that sort of safetyism was antithetical to speech interests, specifically on college campuses, and what's going on right now.
I've been a supporter of the group FIRE that fights these First Amendment cases, no matter what the topic, for allowing students to express their opinion, whether it's to the right or to the left. But I will say that it isn't all about the First Amendment. So if I'm the president of Harvard and I can't look you in the eye and say it's despicable that Hamas killed all these civilians in the desert on October 7th, that has nothing to do with the First Amendment. It has nothing to do with allowing people to have a crappy opinion and not care that Jews were killed. But it's not really a civilized sort of position or somebody I would want to have be president of a university. So there will be questions about things that you can say, in the same way that I wouldn't want a president who is a member of the KKK or something, but people have the right to have despicable opinions. But you really don't want a president of a university to say, well, if someone says that, genocide of Jews, it depends on the context. Well, in a court case, it might depend on the context, and it might be something that you're allowed to say, but it's not something. Many of these groups get money. Like, for example, the money is collected through everybody's tuition, then you give money back to these groups. So there are some groups that I wouldn't give money to, and it doesn't mean I don't believe in the First Amendment, but if your group says that killing civilians on October 7th and Hamas doing that was, they're all for it, I wouldn't give them any student money. And that doesn't mean I don't believe in the First Amendment. It does believe, though, that I think that I don't want my tuition or my dues going to support that. I do agree that there are some things that people have gone over the top. Does everybody that says I want freedom from the river to the sea mean that they want to kill all the Jews? No, I think that that's a leap, and people have a right to say those things. But I think when you represent a university, there's sort of a little bit of a different standard. And I think the presidents of the 3 Ivy League schools that came forward, they were sort of tone deaf to the idea that the First Amendment is not something that keeps you from condemning bad speech. It'd be sort of like in the Brandenburg case. Legally, Brandenburg was right. He was a KKK member and he had the right to a parade permit, and I would have voted that way in a court. But if I would have been head of Ohio State, I wouldn't have invited him to come speak. You know what I mean? So it isn't always just sort of the strict analysis of the First Amendment on speech. There are things that are despicable that shouldn't really be given a forum. But it's actually been the opposite in recent years. You know, if I don't use the proper pronouns for people at Harvard, they'll probably kick me out of school and they wouldn't let me give a speech on campus if I was using the wrong pronouns. But if I say that it was okay what Hamas did, apparently it depends on what context. That to me is, you know, people from the right have said that's kind of ridiculous.
Senator Paul, just to clarify, do you have any factual evidence that anybody has been kicked off of Harvard's campus for the wrong use of pronouns?
There was an evolutionary biology professor who was made the horrific mistake of saying pregnant women, and he was admonished by the diversity, equity, and inclusion officer to say pregnant people. And I just think that's ridiculous.
I just want to be clear.
If that's the world we live in. You can't condemn Hamas for killing civilians, but you're going to condemn a professor for saying pregnant women.
Well, I just want to clarify a couple of things.
I mean, that's crazy.
The issue with the professors was not that they wouldn't condemn the actions on October 7th or that they said that they didn't think that the murder of civilians on October 7th wasn't horrible. The question they were asked was whether or not calls for genocide, which I would argue did not happen, but calls for genocide were in conflict with the conduct of the policy of student conduct on university. You've spoken to this, I think, pretty compellingly and written about this, Robbie, yourself, that the question that they were answering was whether or not it translated into conduct. So does the policy actually say you're allowed to say X, Y, and Z as long as it's not obviously targeted towards students? Right. You're not going up to people's rooms and knocking on their doors and things like that.
I think there is a double standard here in the sense that if you were on Harvard's campus and you were going up and taunting another student and calling him and he wanted to be called her, that would be part of the bullying process. And really, that is kind of bullying. I'm not really for people going up and taunting people and doing that, but that would be enforced. But we saw people who were pro-Palestinian going up to Jewish students, surrounding them as a group, and I know what that's like, surrounding them, sort of, you know, not letting them get away, coming up in their face, holding a Palestinian flag in their face, and, you know, saying
Senator
shame,
Paul,
shame,
with
shame.
all due respect,
that is
I
bullying,
know what event
and
you're
frankly,
talking
that's
about.
not freedom of speech. And you should be, I think there should be a punishment for bullying
I do know
students.
what event you're talking about, and with all due respect, that was an event at Harvard Business School where a bunch of pro-Palestinian protesters are having a lying in state on the floor, where a bunch of actually Zionist protesters came up to them and started stepping over them, harassing them, and then pro-Palestinian de-escalators held up the kefias as barriers between them and the pro-Palestinian activists that they were attacking. I know that got really misrepresented in clips that were going viral around the media, but it was pretty clear that that wasn't an instance of pro-Palestinian students going after Zionist students, but actually quite the reverse. But I take your point that under any circumstances, attacking students and targeting students is a big difference from speech.
Senator Paul, before we let you go, I wanted to get your just kind of broad take on the situation we're living in right now, the world getting more dangerous again. There's a war in Ukraine. There's a war going on in Gaza. A lot of us remember, we libertarians remember the post 9/11 era where a lot of mistakes were made and a lot of violations of civil liberties, like the one you're fighting right now, got enshrined into law. What is your warning and lesson for the American people and more so for their elected representatives as we contemplate what policies would be wise at this moment in time?
I think it's incredibly important that we think about the principles and not always the specifics of the person who's involved in the principles. And I gave a speech recently, or a talk recently, to a law firm, and I asked them how many people remember Jerry Spence. And Jerry Spence was a liberal Democrat, Jewish guy, famous lawyer from out in the West, but he defended a white separatist that he got from Ruby Ridge in Idaho, and he won the case. The Brandenburg case, once again, a Jewish lawyer and a black lawyer defending somebody who is despicable, saying despicable things. The principle is more important than the actual person. And this is a real problem, and I think it's gotten worse, that we are so tribal in I like Donald Trump or I hate Donald Trump, that it's become, we can't see beyond. And the fact that the left can't understand that what was done to Carter Page could be done to the left also, and is a horrific thing, that we used a secret warrant to go after a political campaign, and the evidence presented to the FBI was paid for by the Clinton campaign. You shouldn't have to have an opinion on Trump. You could even say he's a terrible person, I'll never vote for him, but you should support the principle, the left should, that's a great overstep by Fisa, and we should rein it in. And I wish there was more of it, but I think that tribalism and not thinking about principles and thinking about the actual people involved has driven us further and further apart.
Do you think President Biden has any plan to bring for the Ukraine war and the funding that has been asked for and given over and over again? I know a lot of Republicans are starting to push back on that.
They're still trying to push it before Christmas. Most of us think it's done until the new year, but we're still here. I'm here in Washington, and they're talking about still trying to get a deal before Christmas. My point has always been we don't have the money. We borrowed $1 trillion in the last 3 months. We're up to $34 trillion in debt. And my oath of office is to the United States. I can't say it's a good idea for my country to borrow money from China to send it to Ukraine. I also think that ultimately the peace over there is going to have to be a negotiated one. I don't think Russia has the might to defeat Ukraine, nor does Ukraine have the might to push Russia out. And some foreign policy analysts have been sort of liking this to Korea, where there were 500 discussions for armistice. 40% of the deaths continued, but they at least started talking. And in the end, they sort of agreed to disagree. South Korea still says the whole peninsula is theirs. North Korea says the whole peninsula is theirs. And it's an uneasy peace with a demilitarized zone, but it isn't perfect. But I think that may end up being what the result comes out of Ukraine.
Senator Paul, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.